They cut the transmission when Mara screamed. It was a thin, keening sound that had no place in a laboratory full of calibrated silence, an animal sound, half grief, half remembering, and the feed blinked to black before the engineers could scrub her face from the public record. In the recording, the lights had gone violet for a quarter of a second, the microscope lens had steamed as if something living exhaled against glass, and Mara Voss, renowned for her meticulous denial of miracles, clutched the sample like a corpse and mouthed words she couldn't have known. They chose me. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The clip ricocheted through the small hours, late-night talkers with rumpled collars, viral threads threaded with conspiracy, and the tight, muted corridors of intelligence briefings where people who used to be allowed to sleep stared at the same frozen face and felt their stomachs drop. That was how Cole Armitage first saw Mara Voss, a silhouette under emergency light, pale hands balanced over a petri dish, eyes wide enough to hold an ocean. He saw the headline before the lab report. Elon Musk said, "They chose me," and what he revealed about Mars is terrifying. 2 sentences on a wire, and every back channel that had tolerated secrecy for years snapped awake. Cole's badge, metal, serrated, a shape that implied authority more than it declared. His entire career lived in that weight. The coalition he served answered to consortium boards and emergency committees, to investors who laughed in a currency of billion-dollar risks. He had been promoted for being useful, calm under interrogation, decisive when choices were uglier than options. He was the man who reassigned personnel at midnight, who moved evidence into folders with names like containment, legacy, who closed doors softly enough that the hinges told no tales. When his briefing officer slid Mara's file across the table, Cole read the mind twice as if it might betray a typo. Paleobiologist, previously skeptical, now subject to anomalous cognitive flash. His orders were 3 words and a threat: escort to Valles Marineris. Mara arrived at the orbital transfer station with her jaw ringing in a rhythm of denial. She'd built a career on explanations, sedimentation rates, depositional context, microtextures that fooled less meticulous eyes into seeing life where none had ever been. She had taught undergraduates to count strata the way choir boys practice scales, until the sample from Ridge Site 9 hummed under her shutter. In the lab, it had been a hum, impossible to explain, a pattern embedded in silica that repeated not just in space but in time, a fractal rhythm that her instruments translated into a waveform resembling not music but speech. Then the memory came, a flash so intimate it felt like a bruise, of warmth on her wrist, of a touch that tasted like wind on iron, and a scent that wasn't alien so much as pre-human. She had screamed, and then the world had heard. "Dr. Voss?" Cole's voice was like everything he'd been trained to practice, steady, modulated, the veneer of kindness that made coercion smooth. He met her at the ingress, the noise of the transfer hub folding around them. She was smaller than the video suggested, thinner at the shoulders, eyes wine-dark and bruised with sleep or sleeplessness, he couldn't decide which. Under the fluorescent glare, she smelled faintly of disinfectant and something older, crushed leaves, the smell of her mother's garden back on Earth, of ground that could remember rain. "Agent Armitage," she said without warmth, "am I under arrest?" He kept his hands visible. "You're not under arrest. You're under escort. You're going to the colony beneath Valles Marineris to consult on a specimen that requires context. You'll be debriefed. You'll be kept within parameters. You will not speak to the press. You will not discuss the specimen outside authorized channels." The list was a chain, each clause a link. It crushed like a glove around her ribs. "And if I refuse?" "Refusal is a career choice," he said. "It comes with consequences that affect more than you." Mara's laugh was bloodless. "So I either go quietly and keep a secret that could topple governments, or I stay quiet and become an outcast who no one listens to again. That's very generous." Cole's face didn't crack. There was an old photograph he kept in a file drawer, no one else knew about it, of a boy with a cracked baseball mitt, smiling at someone invisible. He'd once believed that smile into being. Now he substituted small mercies for bigger truths. "There's a colony," he said. "People live there. If anything in your analysis suggests threat to them, that risk trumps all of our curiosities." "Then let me speak to the colony's scientific lead," Mara said. "Let me see the context. You can't ask me to interpret a fragment and call it the totality." Cole watched her for a long second,
as if cataloging every micro-expression with the same clinical attention she credited to our microscopes. "You won't," he said finally. "You'll see what you need to see. You won't be able to publish anything without advisory clearance, and if your sample indicates a hazard, you will be required to follow containment protocols." She folded her arms as if shelling fragile eggs. "Containment for what, Cole? For microbes? For ideas? For the truth?" He didn't answer that the coalition's mandate had long since blurred the difference between microbes and idea. Both could be weaponized, both could be monetized, both could burn. What he told her instead was procedural. The shuttle times, the no-fly windows, the names of the people she'd be allowed to contact. It sounded mundane, bureaucratic, and precisely because of that it made her bristle.
If he was the face of a system sworn to silence, he was also the only face she could trust to keep the rules from cracking during transport. They rode tethered between orbits in a transfer pod that hummed like a living thing. In 0G, conversation rearranged itself. Mara clung to a strap with a knuckle whitening that matched her temper. The pod's window was a round, dark eye, Mars a distant bruise, the valleys a scar across the planet's flank. The news feeds had animated the scar into menace. Musk's quote looped in pundits' mouths, "They chose me." Some said it an admission of cosmic bargaining. Others said showmanship. The clip on which Mara had been recorded was emblematic of a certain human tendency. We loudmouthed our fear until it sounded like prophecy. On the second hour, Cole broke the silence. "Do you know why they sent you alone?" he asked. Mara's fingers went still. "Because I'm a lone wolf? Because I have a track record? Because you like the drama?" "No." He met her eye, and for a fraction of a heartbeat, the air in the capsule vibrated with something that was not strictly professional. "You were the one who could have said there was nothing miraculous about those rocks. If you now say there is, it will be more difficult to dismiss. They sent you because your voice carries authority. We need your authority for containment." Her mouth formed a question she didn't say. He answered it anyway. "The coalition prefers control. They'd rather adapt policy than admit fear." He exhaled. "I'm not a judge, just an agent." Mara let herself imagine a greater calculus behind him, decisions made by people whose faces were never on camera, whose hands layered redactions across the world. She imagined investors and generals and scientists in rooms smelling of coffee and synthetic leather, where Musk's confession had been a catalyst for panic. If someone on the inside claimed an agency, then the problem could no longer be contained by PR. It needed people like her and like Cole to re-enchant the containment. When they docked with the orbital relay that served the colony's shadowed entrance, the paperwork multiplied like barnacles. Cole moved with the ease of a man who'd memorized opacity. Doors opened at his touch, Andromeda badges acknowledged him. He read and signed, and Mara watched the ledger of her life reassign itself. There were screenings, body scans that made her feel reducible to a pulse and a radiation printout, and interviews that were mostly perfunctory until she arrived at the quarantine vestibule. A nurse with the steady hands of someone who'd washed bodies in floods of grief told her they'd be isolating her for 48 hours. "Standard," the nurse said, offering a smile like a bandage. "We need to establish baseline cognitive patterns given your anomalous report." Mara was not a person who liked the word anomalous. It suggested otherness, and otherness suggested threat.
She thought of the touch she couldn't explain, the warmth at her wrist, and wondered whether it had been a memory of something ancient or a fabrication of a mind stressed beyond humane limits. She wanted to run experiments until the truth bled from the rock, until pattern and paradox were reconciled. Cole shadowed her through the corridors that smelled of ozone and recycling. Their proximity made small ellipses that her body recognized as safety and his recognized as duty. He kept his arm's length measure away, but his presence gnawed at something that had been starved in her, a need to be seen, to be believed. The space between them shivered like a wire. He was the one who could lock her out of the colony. She was the one who might bring a thing that could either terraform a planet or obliterate the people she had just met. At the entrance to the subterranean vestibule, Cole paused and turned to her. "There are things you should know," he said. "Not classified things. They're classified in the sense that we have protocols. But you should know what a colony is like here. It's small. It holds people who've been told their lives are secondary. It's fragile. If what you found is what it appears to be, everyone here will be vulnerable." He didn't say vulnerable to what? Public scorn? Corporate extraction? The unfamiliar organism beneath Mars? But his throat tightened. Mara felt the weight of a decision condense in her gut. She had come looking for evidence to close a case, to name a pattern and end the rumor, to return to her lectures with her authority intact. Instead, she was standing on the lip of a planet's wound, with a man who could reorder her life, and a sample in her pocket that pulsed like an accusation. The dilemma landed like a meteor.
tell the truth and risk opening the colony to forces that would exploit or destroy it? Or withhold it and become complicit in a silence that might be complicity in murder? You are asking me to be quiet, Mara said finally, voice low. Cole's jaw softened. I'm asking you to be careful. The vestibule door side closed behind them, sealing the muffled hubbub of the relay away. Light narrowed down the passage into something intimate. The colony beneath Vallis Marineris was not a political theater, but a human place. Footsteps echoed with the memory of other people's choices. A sign read, "Welcome, program code Helios," in a font that might have come from a cheerful tech bazaar. Mara felt like she had stepped into a lie that wore a neighborly sweater. When the quarantine officer led her into a small observation chamber, the walls lined with monitors and microbial cabinets, Mara realized how little leverage she had. She had the one thing they wanted, the sample, and they had everything else: the air she breathed, the people she could touch, the data streams that would decide whether she remained a scientist or became an anomaly. Cole closed the comm and stood in the doorway.
His silhouette made a shadow that rested across the threshold between her and the rest of the colony. "This will be an ordered engagement," he said. "You will be introduced to Dr. Ibarra, the lead xenobiologist here. You will have access to the stratigraphic record and to X-series imaging. You will not have external comms. You will not publish pending advisory review. Understand?" Mara took a breath that tasted like recycled oxygen in something metallic. "And if my findings mean the colony or the artifact is in danger?" Cole's hands flexed at his sides. "Then we take containment measures. That may involve restricting access, severing networks, and relocating sensitive personnel. It may involve military liaison. It may involve things you don't like." The corridor lights seemed suddenly too bright. Her sample lay in her pocket like a coin of doom. Her first line of defense, her science, was now a bargaining chip on a table of strategy she had not been invited to. The dilemma hardened at the edge of the act. Follow the rules of an organization that would bury the truth to preserve fragile human life, or expose everything and risk turning a secret garden into a battlefield. Either way, her single, stubborn curiosity would be complicated by love and by power, by a man who could lock the world from her, and by the need to protect the very thing that frightened her most. The shuttle door cycled behind Cole. He left a shape of himself in the doorway, a promise and a threat. Mara pressed her fingertips to the cool of the sample vial in her pocket and felt, briefly and terrifyingly, as if something reached back. The lights in the observation chamber hummed a lullaby of containment, neutral, clinical, designed to soothe, yet Mara's pulse beat a staccato that refused to align with the quiet. She set the sample on the tray as though laying down a sleeping child. The vial's base caught the light and threw it back in a scatter of tiny stars, uselessly romantic in a room where romance could be lethal. Dr. Ibarra arrived like a question mark, small, quick, with hands colored faintly by years of staining samples and adjusting microscopes. He did not look like someone who had secreted away consequences. He looked like someone who loved puzzles and believed in patience. His smile was exhausted and narrow in that way of people who had seen miracles and learned to be afraid of them. "Dr. Voss," he said, voice almost gentle. "We've been following your work. Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me," Mara replied, watching the way his eyes flicked to the vial. "Tell me what you know. Tell me what you believe is under this mesa." Ibarra's fingers hovered over gloves as if considering whether to touch a page of a dangerous book. "We have ruins," he said. "Structures, chambers, organic matrices woven into mineral, things that should not be. But structure alone doesn't tell motivation. That's where your analysis comes in." Cole stayed in the doorway like a silent adjudicator. His presence was a constant, the measure of protocol, the reminder that everything here had been allocated by authority. But authority, Mara was finding, was porous. The colony's people were not automatons of corporate will. They were tired hands, raw hopes, people who wrote letters to dead parents and kept plants on windowsills that tasted faintly of home. In that humanity, Mara found something that pulled her toward panic and something that pulled her toward restraint. "You should know," Ibarra continued, softer, "that the specimen you found has been cross-referenced with multiple stratigraphic layers. There are microfossils, maybe symbionts, entwined with sedimentary deposits dated centuries older than thought for active biological signatures. It's impossible, but impossible is our job." Mara placed her hands on the tray and felt the metal thrum with recycled air. Impossible until you explain it, she said. Enough mud and pressure and you can make rocks sing like bones. The thing I saw in the spectrogram, she reached for her tablet and scrolled, showing Cole and Ibarra waveforms, repeats in a way life sometimes repeats. The problem is not in the pattern, but in its complexity. There are modulations that suggest information transfer. Language? Cole asked, the single word like a thrown gauntlet. Mara hadn't meant to say it. The word hovered, as dangerous and magnetic as a lit match. Not language as we know it, but a carrier of structure. Information embedded at microscales. It's as if the rock is an archive. Ibarra leaned back, the chair creaking like a groan of disbelief. An archive of what? Mara's throat closed on a memory she couldn't file, the warmth on her wrist, the scent like wind on iron. The image of a hand, no, not like a human hand, pressing something into her palm, and the feeling of it choosing her, as if selection were an intimate act. She'd tried to file it under stress hallucination, under sleep deprivation, under the misfiring neurons of someone who read patterns into clouds. Now she had to admit to both men what she couldn't fully own. I don't know, she said finally, but I remember something. A touch, a name, not a proper name, more like a designation. It made me feel as if I had been read. Cole's jaw tightened. He moved closer, not to take her sample but to close the space that had been carved between them earlier. Read how? He asked. Like a medical scan. A greeting. Like being selected. The confession sat on her tongue like a brand. Like I was showing them how to find me. The room inhaled with them. Ibarra's expression softened into something that could be called compassion. Memory contamination is a known phenomenon, he said. The human mind will try to integrate stimuli in the absence of explanation. Visual phenomenon can trigger synesthetic associations. The problem is distinguishing between signal and noise. Mara nearly laughed. So we throw up our hands and call the thing noise because it terrifies our assumptions. Not advocation of fear, Ibarra said. Caution. We must be careful with words. A phrase like, they chose me, he glanced at Cole, then at Mara, can carry political power. It can start cults. It can justify warfare. Cole's face went slack with an expression Mara had learned to fear, the soldier's neutrality, the one who swallowed empathy for utility. And it can be exploited, he said, for terraforming initiatives, for biotechnologies, for market leverage. The coalition cannot allow an uncontrolled narrative. But you can allow it in a closed chamber, Mara jabbed a finger at him. You can study without the world knowing, and in that chamber you can still do harm. You can privatize life. Cole's shoulders bristled like an animal's neck. This is not a free-for-all. His voice lost its practiced calm. There are people here. We will not risk them for a headline. And whose life counts more? Mara snapped. The colonists' lives are pinned to the wall with directives none of them signed for. You choose who to protect with secrecy and who to sacrifice to calm some boardroom's panic. Her words startled her as much as they did him. The room recoiled in small ways, the way sound will compress and then spring. Cole's eyes met hers in a way devoid of the usual protocol, raw and edged. This is not about sacrifice, he said, quieter. This is about triage, about making choices when the alternatives are worse. You think I like giving orders that limit people? You think I enjoy being the man who says no to someone who wants to see their child for the last time? I make choices because someone has to. If you're asking me whether I sleep at night, he stopped, swallowing a truth he had been trained to keep from words. Mara's harshness softened because she saw suddenly that Cole wasn't an agent of a faceless machine so much as a person who had been worn into his function. He had been entrusted with hard things and kept company by guilt. The image of the boy with the cracked mitt flashed in her memory again, and for a sliver of a second, she imagined how that kid would have reacted if someone had told him to carry the weight of other people's lives. I'm not accusing you, she said, and meant it in that small, precise way of someone trying to find a foothold. I'm accusing a system, and if you happen to be its instrument, I'm an instrument who can be turned. He held her gaze like a dare. I can follow orders, or I can do something else. The insinuation hung between them like a half-formed promise. Mara found herself leaning into it despite the danger. There was a pull that had nothing to do with authority or procedure. It had to do with the way Cole's eyes scraped her like sandpaper and left behind honest places she hadn't recognized. Their proximity became a battleground. For every pioneer of intimacy,
There is a protocol, the measured steps, the consent shaped like a handshake.
Here, the rules were porous and the stakes were planetary. Mara wanted to test his boundaries, not because she trusted him, but because the alternative, alienation, felt like death. If she could loosen him from the Coalition's grasp, perhaps she could protect the small people who tended their basil and mended their children's toys beneath Mara's scarred skin. "There's a thing in me that remembers," she said, softer now. "And if I'm honest, I don't want to be alone with it." Cole's face altered at that admission. The armor around him shifted. For one tiny, vibrating moment, he was the boy in the photograph. "You're not," he said. The words were not procedural. They were not sanctioned. They were almost tender, and it made Mara's breath catch. A nurse came in then, a bureaucratic interruption, and announced that Mara's quarantine period would be shortened pending preliminary agreement to limited observational studies. The small mercy came with a string. She would be assigned a handler during waking hours, and any interactions in the public areas of the colony would be monitored. Mara bristled at the watchful eyes, at the idea of every kind word being filtered through someone else's rationale. Yet even as she bristled, she felt Cole's watchfulness as something less than simply surveillance. He had, by the nature of his job, the authority to make her life infinitely smaller. But standing in that sterile room, watching him fight with the contours of duty and human feeling, she realized that power could be a hinge. "There's a group on the rim," Ibarra said as he closed the file. "A collective that believes in rapid contact, letting the artifact speak freely and interpreting in situ. And another group wants a full extraction to Earth. We need to know what the organism wants, if anything, or whether we are imposing narrative on a geological phenomenon. Or whether the organism is imposing on us," Mara said. They left the observation chamber with a plan that sounded like patience and read like a deadline. Cole walked with her as far as the intake corridor would allow, each step a negotiation. She wanted to ask him to defy the Coalition. She wanted to beg him to protect the colony from opportunists who would flay it for technology and financial gain. She wanted to tell him the truth about her memory, to give him the shape of the touch that had selected her. Instead, she found herself asking a smaller question, one that felt foolishly intimate in a landscape of treacherous calculus. "If they chose you," she said, eyes lowered, "do you think they could choose someone else? Or is it like choosing both of us?" Cole's answer came in a whisper meant only for her. "I don't know what they are capable of," he said, "but I know we can choose how to respond. And if I can make a choice here, Mara Voss, it's to stand where people are getting hurt." She wanted to say the name that hummed at the edge of her memory, to test whether saying it aloud would make it real. She did not. Instead, she let the thread between them stretch and hold, an unspoken covenant. It was the beginning of a different sort of alliance, not of committee rooms or sealed memos, but of two people who had been given roles by fate and now might invent their own. As they separated, him back to his duties, her to a room that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant, Mara pressed her hand against the vial in her pocket. The sample did not answer. It did not, in that moment, need to. What mattered was the choice she'd made, the fragile and dangerous intimacy forming like lichens along a canyon wall. The colony existed, she knew now, not as an abstraction of geopolitics, but as a congregation of small lives. There would be fights over ideology, over access, over how much of the planet's mystery to monetize. There would be betrayals. There would also be tenderness. The push and pull of those hours ahead would be a test. Could curiosity and caution be turned into allies? Or would the place between them become a battlefield where the most human impulses, love, fear, desire for legacy, were harnessed as weapons? Mara lay down that night in a narrow sleeper bunk and watched the ceiling like a sky. The touch she remembered wasn't purely fear. It had also been a promise. To be chosen was to be seen. That duality, sight as gift and as exposure, would be the axis on which every choice turned. In the dark, Cole's shadow, figurative, bureaucratic, perhaps real, seemed to rest across her chest. She did not know if he could be trusted. She did not know if the Coalition could be defied. But she did know that the next morning would ask of her a bravery she had not rehearsed for.
to speak truth that could endanger people she was just beginning to care for, or to hold the secret and become an accomplice. Somewhere beneath the mesa, a thing breathed. In the echoing hollows of the colony, men and women slept in shifts, their dreams braided with fear and hope. The push of their desires and the pull of their obligations will, in the days to come, make or break them. Mara closed her eyes and for the first time since the clip, allowed herself to imagine a future in which truth and care did not have to be opposites. It felt dangerously like hope. They cut the transmission when Mara screamed. It had left an after-image on the colony, the sound of someone who knew a door had been forced and could never be shut again. It began with a leak, a misrouted data packet that slid into Mara's observation feed like a bad dream. She noticed it because the spectral analyzer she'd been granted was old and honest. It spat out anomalies where the glossy interface buried them. She stayed late, hands cramped from the steady, forensic work that clarified facts into verdicts. The night was thin with the soft breathing of the colonists. The generator hummed like distant wails.
The packet arrived as a line of numbers that shouldn't have been visible to her security tier. A field log stamped with Cole Armitage's credentials, and a second header she had not seen in any rubric: Operation Choice. Her throat tightened. She could have closed the feed, turned it off, and slept like a person without a conscience. Instead, she opened it. The file was not a formal report, but a conversation clipped and labeled in a shorthand that sounded like negotiation. Cole's voice, calm, American, the voice that had guided her through rules and corridors, came through with other timbre beneath it: fatigue, an ache that had no place in official channels. The other voice was a synthetic overlay, genderless, as if someone had fed a speaker to a translator tuned to neutrality. Between them, a transcript scrolled. Relocation is not feasible without a trigger. Extraction to Earth bankrupts the colony and flattens us politically, Cole said. If the organism can be contained locally, if it can be negotiated with, then direct engagement with a representative might prevent weaponization. There was a pause. The synthetic voice offered a sequence of probabilities, sterile and precise. Cole's answer came a half-beat too quick. We cannot allow public panic to compromise operations. You understand the cost of disclosure. On the next line, a designation she had only encountered in old trade dossiers blinked: hybrid recon. Then a sentence that landed in her ribs like a fist: we have someone local who remembers contact. She can be a bridge. The file closed. Mara's hands trembled. It was possible, she told herself, that she was reading too much into a bureaucratic memo, that people sketched contingency plans out of habit. But the word bridge, a person chosen because they remembered contact, made the memory at her wrist bloom again. Chosen, read, selected. The pattern she had been loath to admit might be more than coincidence. She sought Cole in the mornings. He was at the comms hub, hair flattened from sleep and eyes glassy with a tired vigilance that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with grief. He smiled at her, small and brittle, like a thing taped together to perform. She wanted to ask him if he'd authorized the memorandum. Instead, she let the accusation craft itself on her tongue. You put my name on a file, she said without greeting. He blinked, and the reflex in his face, practiced, healed by years of deflection, arrived too slow. What are you talking about? The hybrid recon memo. It mentioned a bridge, and she felt ridiculous, a scientist making terror into a question. It referenced someone who remembers. He inhaled. The air between them heated. You read the log? I should not have had access, she said, but I did. Did you call me a bridge, Cole? Was you the one deciding who they picked? Cole's jaw worked. He had been a man of procedural absolutes. She had watched him turn mad gear and steer lives. Now the gear turned in private, and she wanted to know why. We flagged you as a potential asset, he said slowly, voice stripped of training, not without reason. An asset? The word tasted like ash. You mean you used me? He did not flinch. The lack of flinch seemed worse than cowardice. It was intimacy without consent. I used my clearance to make sure your presence would be authorized on site, he said. I arranged limited access under quarantine to keep you and the colony safe from opportunists. Or to keep me from talking, Mara said, to make me manageable. Cole's face shifted into a mask Mara recognized as exhausted honesty. I chose containment because releasing your findings uncorked a cascade we can't afford. I did it to buy time. Time for what? She wanted to ask. Time to weaponize? Time to study in secret? Time to rewrite history without public input? Time for a corporation to patent life? Did you tell them about my memory? She asked. Did you tell them I'd said they chose me? His silence was loud enough to answer. I mentioned observed distress and anomalous cognitive response, he said, nothing more. Mara had always prided herself in dispassion. She had catalogued, objectively, the ways human beings made meaning out of patterns. Now she sat in a room with the man who had the authority to rearrange her life and felt meaning crush her like a hand closing. "So you lied to me," she said, the accusation raw. "You lied to get me here." He ran a hand through his hair, the soldier's gesture of someone trying to gather himself. "I lied because I had to," he said, "because there are players you don't understand, because some of us decided secrecy was better than a public trial that would wreck this colony, because sometimes—" He stopped, the rest of his sentence a choked thing. "Sometimes the alternative is worse." "What alternative?" she demanded. "Tell me the worst you'll tell yourself to spare them." He looked at her as if trying to shape a truth she could hold. "There's a faction in the consortium that would, if given the right legal cover, attempt extraction and weaponization. You know the stakes. A thing that can influence mineral matrices, that can embed information into stone. You don't have to imagine how that could be perverted." Mara's mind spun. She imagined a boardroom as cold as the vacuum above them, men and women making profit charts from living tissue. She had spent her life thinking the world could be convinced by evidence, but the file had shown her that evidence could be selected, timed, withheld. Experts could be curated. "You could have told me the scale," she said. "You could have given me agency beyond being a variable in your risk assessment." "I tried to," he said, and for the first time a tremor touched his voice. "I tried to brief you without triggering panic. They wouldn't allow it." "Who wouldn't?" she demanded. "Who told you to rope me in and call it aid?" Cole's face hardened in a way that signaled both defense and defeat. "An internal directive, Project Custos. It's a coalition initiative. It aims to manage extraterrestrial contact without destabilizing terrestrial economies. I was part of the liaison team, until I parted ways." He mumbled the last words as if they were disgraced. Mara realized then that his detachment had not been purely professional. He'd paid a price, and secrecy had been the coin used to buy him a place at the table. "You left them," she said slowly, "and then you came back." "Not everyone has the luxury of permanent exile," he said. "Sometimes you take a role to protect people from inside the machine." "You protect them by making choices without them," she said. "That looks like arrogance, Cole. It looks like colonialism." The words struck him like a physical blow. For a moment he looked younger than she had ever seen him. No badge, no training, only a man with an unwillingness to look away from things he thought he could fix. "I thought allowing controlled engagement could prevent worse outcomes," he said. "I thought I could steer their decisions, keep the greed and the headlines at bay." "What happens when you steer wrong?" she asked. "What happens when the person at the helm can't see how much damage is being done?" He did not answer. Instead, he offered another fragment of truth. The log shed he'd read had not been a simple negotiation. It contained a clause, an ethical loophole coded in legalese that allowed for limited human interface under strictly controlled circumstances. The clause named a class of humans explicitly, hybrid denoted. A further line, more brutal in its clarity, suggested selecting a volunteer or identifying candidate via cognitive markers. "Your sample," he said, reluctantly, "was flagged due to the anomalous memory you reported. For them, you are the test case that might give us language with the organism. For me, you are a person who shouldn't be exploited." Mara felt bile rise. "So you used me to save them from themselves." "I tried to save them from the market," he said, "from the military, from the people who would see a profit in pain.
I thought if I could keep things here, small, negotiated, contained, we could have time to do this ethically. Ethically by hiding it, she said. The words were slippery and terrible. Cole, you're still making the choice alone. He looked as if he'd been struck. The expression was raw, haunted self-awareness, the awful mirror of accountability. Maybe I am, he said. Maybe I don't get to be the arbiter. The breach between them widened. What had been a fragile intimacy now lay exposed to the chill. Mara had sought to find in him the one person who could defy the coalition. Instead, she found a man who had chosen a different kind of compromise. It was a revelation that cut a thin, precise line through them both. He had not been her ally by default.
He had been another hand of the machine. Betrayal, when it arrives, is not always violent. It can be procedural, codes in a file, the omission of a truth that reshapes trust. Mara felt the cloak of partnership slip from her shoulders, like a coat in a damp wind. She had expected to be persuaded by his pragmatism. She had not accounted for the grief that would arrive when she recognized that he had been deciding for her. "You told me you weren't a judge," she said. "You said you were just an agent." "I am an agent," he insisted, "but I'm also a man who thinks he can protect people by choosing for them." "Choosing isn't protecting," she said. "It's taking the right away from those who deserve it." For a long minute, Cole's face was a study in shame. You could see the calculus he had rehearsed: orders versus conscience, policy versus humanity. He moved toward her as if to bridge the breach, but stayed an arm's length back, as if respecting boundaries was a new rule he had to learn. "I'll fix it," he said, too quickly. "I'll get you access, proper access. We'll bring in independent oversight." Mara's laugh was a dry, painful sound. "You might be able to change a file," she said. "You might get me in front of her committee. But you can't undo the fact that I was drafted into something I didn't consent to. You can't make me forget that I was used as bait." Cole's eyes filled, an anomaly in a man schooled to maintain composure. He looked like someone pleading with a jury he had no right to convene. "I didn't want to use you," he said. "I wanted to keep you safe." "By lying to me," she said. "I'm sorry." The apology was insufficient and morphed into something animal and honest. "I'm trying to live with the things I've done," he said. "I thought if I could keep the contact from becoming a commodity, I'd sleep easier." "And yet you brought me here," Mara said. "You tethered me to them." Cole closed his eyes, as if weighing whether confession or silence would be less destructive. When he opened them, there was a decision made in the split-second case. He would not justify himself with plans. He would not ask for forgiveness like a plea. He would give her space to decide what to do next. "Do whatever you must," he said. "I'll stand down if you tell me to." Mara imagined the sort of stand-down he offered, a bureaucratic removal, a retraction. She also imagined the systems that would swallow a man who refused the directive of a consortium. She thought of the colony, of Ibarra's tired smile, of the gardeners and children downstairs who had no voice in these negotiations. She thought of the touch, a selection that happened before she was a consenting adult, and how it had altered her. Betrayal had cracked something between them, but it had not obliterated it. Underneath the rupture, a louder question persisted. Could the person who had been complicit in a lie be trusted to stand against the machine that made the lie necessary? Could love, if this was love, which Mara still refused to name, be anything other than a wound stitched with truth? She left him then, retreating to her bunk with the bright sense of a line drawn in sterile light. The colony went on around them, its ordinary moments turning like gears in a clock they had all agreed to wind. But in the quiet of her sleeper, Mara felt the geometry of her future reconfigure. She could be the bridge they wanted, a tool for their phased contact. Or she could be a voice that insisted on public reckoning, that demanded that humanity be given a say in the moment it encountered the possibility of being chosen. Outside, beneath the mesa, something moved in the dark with a patience that did not consult committees. The organism, if that is what it was, had chosen her for reasons she couldn't parse. And in choosing her, it had thrown her into the raw politics of survival. The fractures that now opened in the colony were not only institutional, they were human. Secrets had a way of breeding mistrust, and mistrust turned tenderness into suspicion. That night, Mara's dreams were jagged with images of hands, human and other, reaching and missing each other. Waking, she understood that the only thing that could mend what had been broken would be a new kind of courage. A willingness from both of them to move beyond justifying their actions and toward a messy, shared accountability. It required him to risk his place, and her to risk exile. When morning found the colony, the news feed from Earth had bloomed another hashtag, "They chose me," trending with conspiracy and prayer. The leak she had found would make its rounds. Someone would come looking for the truth. Mara dressed slowly and slid the sample into a locker that Cole could not access without a keycard he would have to justify. The sample's glass looked fragile, but its power had already proved otherwise. She would not be the bait anymore, not if she could help it. But she could not, in good conscience, abandon the people who lived here either. The fracture with Cole lay open and raw. It would not close with blood, apology, and action. The rest of Act 3 promised secrets to be revealed and choices to be made. She set her jaw with a decision born of wounded clarity. She would press the organism for answers, but she would also force the coalition into a light it had spent years avoiding. If she had been chosen, she intended to choose back. Cole watched her leave and at last understood the true weight of what he'd done, how a supposed protection could look like predation. He had traded transparency for containment and found that secrecy corroded trust. He moved then, quietly, to put his badge into a drawer and take out a paper ledger he kept for things he couldn't digitize. He began to write names, people whose lives would be affected if the secret bled into headlines. He wrote them not to control them, but to keep them in his mind as human faces to protect. There would be fractures yet to endure. A dissident strike was hinting at mobilization on the rim. A corporate envoy had been sighted near the orbital relay. And someone on Earth would soon demand public testimony. Secrets, once loosened, multiply until they are a chorus. But within that chorus, two notes remained possible: confession and resistance. Whether those two could be combined into something like trust would be the test the colony could not avoid. By the time the sun edged across the canyon lip and painted the colony in a pale, stubborn gold, they had both made private vows that would decide whether they would break each other or build together. The fracture between them would not heal quickly. It would ache and reform, scar and reopen. But somewhere, between fear and the desire to do right, something fragile and dangerous stirred. An ember of insistence that neither clause nor secret could entirely smother. Cole found her at the rim, where the day's light spilled across the canyon like a benediction and a threat at once. The colony's bustle was a muffled susurration behind them. Here the wind carried only thin grit and a feeling of being very small beneath an immense sky. Mara waited with her back to the vaulting lip, the sample locked now inside a locker whose code she alone had memorized, as if secrecy could be made physical by muscle memory. He came without badge or entourage, sleeves rolled, the uniform of authority stripped to a plain shirt. When he spoke, his voice did not have the clipped cadence of protocol. It had the raggedness of someone who had stayed awake too many nights holding bad choices in his hands. "I could have let them take you," he said simply. Mara's laugh was sudden and breathless. "You did let them take me," she replied. "You shepherded me into quarantine and called it protection." "I lied," he said. "But I'm trying to quit the habit." He lifted his hands in a small, apologetic gesture. "I'm here to ask a different kind of permission. Will you let me try to help? Properly. No memos, no back-channel clauses. I will put my career on the line. I will stand in the open and call for oversight. I will tell them everything, if you want that.
Or I will help you keep the colony safe while we learn. But I won't use you again." She searched his face and found the boy in the photograph beneath the fatigue. The impulse to protect that had been warped into control. The anger inside her, hot and justified, didn't dampen the deeper thread. Something that felt like care, wrong-footed though it had been. "You think you can fix it with confessions and petitions?" she asked. "You think the consortium will listen?" "No," he admitted. "But they'll have to respond to the optics."
And more importantly, I want you to know I won't be the one hiding you in a ledger while others decide your fate. Something in Mara loosened. It was not a miracle. It was a small, human thaw. She moved closer until the canyon's breath cooled the space between them. "If you're going to stand in the open," she said, "then stand for the people here, not for your career. Promise me that." He met her gaze, and, without ceremony, he kissed the vow into being by answering, "I promise." There was no cinematic swelling, only the honest, trembling relief of two people agreeing, belatedly, on who they wanted to be. They did not pretend past wrongs away. Cole's confession had opened cracks. They would have to be bridged by action. The alarm that cut across the colony's comms was sudden and metallic. A dissident wing from the rim had made a move. Shouts in the public channel, the rattle of boots. Someone had put a price on the organism, and men with guns liked the sound of payment. Mara and Cole exchanged a single look that required no permission. This time, neither would be an instrument alone. They ran. The corridor down to the subchambers was a vein of urgency. Red lights painted their faces in urgent confession. In the lab, Dr. Ibarra's team was already bracing, securing samples and shepherding colonists toward inner bunkers. Cole barked orders he had no right to give, and yet the crew followed, because he had authority, and because now they believed he meant it. The strike came like a proposition: blow the door, take the artifact, sell the miracle. Men in tactical rigs slammed into the antechamber, their intent raw and immediate. For a terrifying second, the colony's fragile polity threatened to be torn apart by rifles and greed. Cole moved first, physically intercepting a soldier who has lashed out for the specimen cabinet. He took a bullet in the shoulder, the sound a horrible punctuation. Mara froze. The world narrowed to the bloom of red on his shirt and the terrible bright knowledge that he had chosen to be the living shield. She did not have time to think scientifically. Instinct and the something that had chosen her surged as one. She stepped between the cabinet and the intruders and opened her mouth, not to reason with them, but to reach for the thing beneath varnish, the memory that had been stamped into her wrist and the pattern encoded in the sample. "I am the bridge," she shouted, voice hoarse and iron as raw muscle. "Stop. Listen." For a mad beat, the assailants hesitated, weapons wavering. In the pause, she drew the vial from her pocket, the one she had promised herself she would never make a bargaining chip, and let the light catch in its glass. The sound beneath the stone in her mind rose like the tide. She spoke the waveforms as she had seen them on a screen, modulated intonations that were neither human speech nor mere noise. It was a reckless, impossible thing, to sing a rock into recognition. The air hummed. The intruders' faces softened, as if a memory of rain had touched them. Cole groaned and slumped to the floor, his breath a ragged metronome. Down in the chamber, something answered. It was not a roar, but a rumor of pressure, a bending of air. The artifact's lights, long dormant, flickered into a steady, breathing bioluminescence, like a living thing acknowledging a hand offered in peace instead of theft. The leader of the attackers lowered his rifle, confusion and awe warring in his features. The colony held its collective breath as the organism, through Mara, offered a pattern that did not promise weaponry or profit, but recognition. It chose to be known on terms that asked for care. Cole's wound bled, but his eyes were bright with something like pride and unbearable tenderness. He had never wanted to be a martyr. He had wanted to be accountable. By taking the bullet, he had taken a risk that unstitched the ledger of secrecy.
Mara dropped to her knees and pressed a hand to his shoulder, the warmth of him a stubborn human thing. "You could have told me," she whispered, fingers steady on the torn fabric. "I know," he said, breath hitching. "And I will. I will tell them everything." As medics moved in, the dissidents melted into confused retreat, their conviction buckling under an encounter that had become humbler than any market pitch. The artifact pulsed faintly, satisfied, or perhaps merely curious, and then, as if tired, it receded into a shimmer of mineral calm. In that aftermath, love did not arrive like a heroic banner. It arrived as two people tending to each other in crude, honest ways. Mara holding Cole's hand while medics taped his wound, Cole watching her with a gratitude that had fewer words and more presence than any declaration. They had not vanquished the coalition, nor had they resolved the politics that would follow, but they had, in a single terrible gesture of sacrifice and voice, altered the terms of engagement. Mara had chosen to speak for the organism rather than to let it be sold. Cole had chosen to break his own silence and risk everything to keep her safe. When the doctors told them he'd need evacuation and oversight, Cole smiled through the pain in a crooked, defiant way. "Then we'll take it into the light," he said. "Together." Mara looked at him, at the stain on his shirt like a map of the night's violence and the day's choice, and felt the shape of a life she had not planned but could imagine, messy, accountable, shared. She leaned forward and kissed him, not as a balm, but as an oath. Beneath the mesa, the organism had chosen, and perhaps in choosing, taught them to choose too. Not secrecy over truth, not possession over people. They had redeemed each other by claiming a risk together, by the small, dangerous act of refusing to let power decide alone. The colony, shaken but intact, breathed into the new pattern they had made: confession, care, and the perilous work of learning to love without owning.
They brought everything into the light. Cole's wound scarred but healed. Tribunals convened, and for once, the cameras found more than sanitized memos. They found colonists, gardeners, children, Ibarra's tired smile, and the organism's quiet testimony. Project Custos splintered under public pressure. Oversight boards, independent scientists, and representatives from the colony negotiated a covenant. No extraction without consent, shared stewardship, and a living registry that belonged to everyone. Mara led the open research, refusing patents, translating the rock music into protocols of care. Cole testified honestly, losing rank and gaining a name remembered for standing in front of a line of guns. They rebuilt trust like a greenhouse, slow, deliberate, watered by apologies and small, daily acts. On the rim, beneath dawn that washed the canyon in fragile gold, they pressed their hands together. The artifact blinked somewhere below, like a distant cart. No longer a prize, but a presence that had taught them the hardest lesson. To be chosen is to be responsible. They stood, two flawed covenants joined, and watched Mars learn to keep its secrets a little less jealously.